morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are, and welcome back to Achampnator Reads. Today I continue with The Last Elf, chapter 36. Dawn rose, cold, foggy, and pale. Yaw shivered. It wasn't just the wound, the exhaustion, and the cold which he no longer had enough energy no to withstand. Losing Urbrow weighed upon him like a boulder. The dragon had been his family, his brother, everyone he loved, or who loved him, seemed destined to die. Everyone but Robbie. Robbie was alive. He had to keep his thoughts fixed on Robbie, on her breath, on her smile, and then the paw lifted enough to let him breathe. After the massive landslide, the refugees had collapsed in a heap, piled on top of one another to keep warm amid the remains of the shacks of Astrid. They had lit some fires to dispel the cold. For Josh, the night had been a ceaseless drip of disappointment. He was constantly hoping to hear the flap of wings, to see the flames. It had to be a fiction, a trick, a kind of joke. It could only be a fiction, a trick, a kind of joke. Perhaps they had injured Urbrow and captured him. They would take him in chains to Delagar and keep him prisoner. He, Josh, would go with his sword and free him. He would face off the whole garrison, and then they would flee together. Urbrow with his big wings open and Josh on top. And yet, at the same time, he knew. One part of him went on telling himself fairy stories, and the other part knew. Josh knew. Josh's mind had been capable of perceiving Urbrow's mind, just as his eyes could see him, and his nostrils smell him. Josh knew that Urbrow was dead. Where the dragon's perception had been, there was now a black hole of frozen non-existence. Josh knew that he was now in hole of frozen. No, huh? Josh knew that he was now in a world where dragons no longer existed, where Urbrow no longer lived. Then a sudden realization froze him like a bucket of river water. He had a habit of thinking of the dragon as a kind of big brother, with a complicated play of multiple and hereditary memories that allowed him to speak in the first person about events that had happened years of centuries before. This habit had made him forget that Urbrow had actually lived for less than 2 months. He had been like a mentor, a meteor. Josh remembered that in the ancient elfish tongue, Urbrow meant comet. Robbie had sobbed for a long time. She too, like her mother, when she was in despair, let liquid flow from her eyes. Her nose was filled with snot, her eyes were red, and her eyelids were swollen, the way they are when you haven't slept for 2 days. On the one hand, Josh still found it extremely eccentric, unhygienic, and uncomfortable, while on the other he wished with all his heart that he could have cried as well. As though all that were not enough, there was also the horror of having to kill. When dawn had lit, the problem of food, had made its reappearance. Everyone was hungry. Everything that they had brought with them, the remains of the banquet in the clearing at the House of Orphans, had been finished some time ago. Astrid's orchards and vines had been felled or burned. Nothing was left but trout. At that point, the Dogan was swarming with fish. Their silvery scales flashed in the water, and Josh had a bow with an elfish arrow. No one had ever dared to ask him, but at a certain point he had found the hunger of all those poor people, especially the children, impossible to bear. Life and death are joined together, Urbrow had said. the death of some was joined to the life of the others. Josh would never hear him say it again. Never again. Never again would he hear him snoring. Never again would he see him breathing. Never again. Whatever he did, the two words echoed inside him. Never again. Josh put the arrow to the string of his bow and took aim. Never again would he hear his voice. As an elf, his aim was infallible, because he aimed with the eyes of his mind, but each time he was turned by the desire to miss, lest he feel the pain of the dying fish. He fired. Never again would he see Urbrow's wings in the sky. Josh saw the arrow hit the trout and felt within him the trout's desolation over its own death. The same thing would happen another 50 times before the day was finished. He had to feed 99 people, and one trout was enough for one adult, or two children, or three babies. The woodcutter threw himself into the water to recover the trout. He and one of the two farmers were the only ones who knew how to swim, and they had to take turns at the task of wading into the freezing water to recover the prey and the only arrow they had at their disposal. Never again. Never again. Never again. Josh started again. He caught another few trout, and after they had eaten, the river of people resumed its march, walking, fishing, and resting in turn. They would reach the waterfall. Josh remembered when he had flown over it on Urbrow's back. Never again. Once more he wished he could cry. They walked, they fished, somebody managed to find some berries. Before sunset, they set up camp. The woodcutter cut big branches of fire, of fir and pine, with which he formed a rough and ready shack. On 4 wood fires, trout lay roasting. They advanced day after day, with the curious sense that time and their lives were somehow suspended in waiting. Josh thought again of the first time he had traveled this way. He had been in a boat, lying on his back, with two marvelous people who had struggled not to eat their smoked trout in front of him. This time the journey was longer, rockier, and more tiring, but they had to go on. Autumn had drawn to close. Any day the first snow would come and things would get much harder. Sometimes the road was easy and they could walk along the shores lined with little beaches, and other times they had to clamber over steep, slimy rocks, slipping in the moss, or, if the banks were impassable, make lengthy detours through the woods, taking care never to stray far from the water, lest they lose their bearings and stray from the path. Suddenly, the waterfall appeared ahead of them. Not all that suddenly. In fact, its presence had been heralded by the roar of the cascading water, but the sight of it was dizzying. The water thundered down from an enormous height, making rainbows where the light fell on it. The sea lay down below. The horizon touched the sky in a long line, interrupted by nothing but a tiny island on which a wild cherry was losing its last leaves. Among the rocks on their right, starting from a tiny beach that could be reached only from the tumultuous waters of the river, there rose the narrow flight of stairs to the very high rock upon which were inscribed the words Hic sunt Dracos. Part of these stairs had collapsed beyond repair, and their inscription was now a lie. Isolated from everything and everyone on the now inaccessible peak, the library guarded its useless treasures. By focusing his attention on Robbie, Josh kept his anguish at bay. Hic sunt Dracos. Here be dragons. Never again, to the end of time. But Robbie existed. The elf reminded himself. Robbie was in the world, and so were the others. He knew them all now, all of them, one by one. It was a curious sensation after the life he had lived in solitude. Robbie existed, and she was with him. He had to go on, thinking that. How do we get past it? Asked Falco, astounded at this magnificent and steep waterfall. I don't know, Yosh replied. We'll never do it, Foulpest added uneasily. Of course we'll do it, Robbie serenely reassured him. We can't we can't not do it. The inhabitants of Astrid have already passed this way. It must be possible. Yosh felt braver. Urbrow mightn't have died in vain. They would do it. He just had to think a bit harder. He looked up about him. The sea was blue around them. The last leaves were brilliant red and gold on the nearly bare branches of the trees, while the peaks of the dark mountains were white with snow. There must be a way. Nothing came to mind. Well, it's not difficult. You've just got to dig, muttered a voice. Two voices. The two miners from Delagar County had christened themselves the Curtis Home Men after some characters from a curious and heroic story invented by Yorsh. After life spent considering themselves as little more than beasts of burden, they had felt filled with a new light of dignity and importance. For the first time in lives spent muttering to each other, the two Curtis Homen had climbed onto the southern part of the ravine and discovered there wasn't just rock, there was earth as well. Using branches as props, they could dig a path against the rock beneath the waterfall. They needed a team of people to pass the duck earth from hand to hand, a few men to take over when their arms were tired, and some straight pieces of wood to support the excavation. If everyone lent a hand, they could do it. That was chapter 36. And how it continues, you will hear in chapter 37. But this, the next time. And with that I say, see ya.